The day my mother's lawyer called, I was standing in the kitchen with my hands buried in soapy water, staring at the cracked tile beneath the sink, when he said my name like it was a mistake. I remember the smell first, lemon dish soap, sharp and clean, and how it didn't match the heaviness that settled in my chest. I remember the hum of the refrigerator, the way the afternoon light cut across the counter, and how ordinary everything looked for a moment that would quietly rearrange my life. "Your mother's estate has been settled," he said. "The house has been left to your sister." I waited for him to say more, for the correction, for the pause where he'd clear his throat and add my name too. Instead, there was only the sound of my own breathing, louder than it should have been. I paid for that house. I paid for it with overtime shifts, with missed vacations, with nights spent awake listening for my mother's cough through the thin walls. I paid for it with my marriage, if I'm being honest, and with years I will never get back. But standing there, with my hands wrinkled and numb in the sink, all I could think was, how do you erase someone who never left? Before all of this, my life was quiet in the way that looks simple from the outside. I worked as a billing coordinator at a small medical office. Nothing glamorous, just steady work that paid the bills if I was careful. I lived alone in a modest apartment on the edge of town, the kind with thin walls and neighbors who cooked strong-smelling food at odd hours. I didn't mind. After my divorce, quiet felt like safety. My mother's house sat 15 minutes away, a squat little place with peeling blue paint and a porch that slanted just enough to make you careful where you stepped. It was the house I grew up in, the one my father left behind when I was 17 and my sister Elaine was 14. Elaine was always the soft one. That's what my mother used to say, brushing my sister's hair while I stood in the doorway, already old enough to braid my own. "She seals things deeply," Mom would whisper, like it was a medical condition. "You're strong. You'll be fine." And I was. I learned early how to be. When Dad left, Mom cried for months. Elaine hid in her room. I cooked dinners from recipes torn out of magazines and learned how to stretch ground beef into 3 meals. I filled out FAFSA forms and sat through parent-teacher conferences while my mother stared out the window, hollowed by disappointment. I didn't resent it then, at least I don't think I did. Responsibility came to me the way breathing does, automatic, unquestioned. By the time Mom's health started to slip years later, it felt natural that the burden landed with me. It began with small things, a missed doctor's appointment, pills left untouched on the counter. One winter morning, she slipped on the porch and sat there too long before anyone noticed. I was the one who took her to the emergency room, my coat still on, my badge swinging from my neck. Elaine lived 2 states away by then. She called often, her voice full of concern and apologies, but there was always a reason she couldn't come. Work deadlines, her kids' schedules, the drive was just too much. Mom needed help with the mortgage when her pension fell short. I didn't even hesitate. I took a second job answering phones at night, wired the money directly to the bank, and told myself it was temporary. It never is. When the house needed repairs, a new roof after a storm, plumbing that rattled like it was coughing itself awake, I paid for those too. Contractors knew my name, not Mom's. Checks came from my account. Receipts piled up in a drawer I never bothered to organize. Sometimes Mom would pat my hand and say, "I don't know what I'd do without you." She'd say it softly, like a confession. And then, almost always, she'd add, "Elaine worries so much about me." I learned to swallow the sharp little feeling that followed. Love, I told myself, didn't need an audience. My days fell into a rhythm. Work in the morning, Mom's house in the afternoon, groceries, prescriptions, light cleaning. On Sundays, I cooked enough food to last her the week. Chicken soup, casseroles, things she could reheat without burning. The house smelled of onions and old wood and the faint medicinal tang of rubbing alcohol. Elaine visited twice a year. When she did, Mom lit up like someone had turned on a brighter bulb. She'd sit straighter, laugh louder, tell the same stories she'd told me 100 times, but with a sparkle that made them new. "You remember when Elaine sang at the school talent show?" Mom would say, looking at me as if I had forgotten. "Such a beautiful voice." I'd nod and smile and refill glasses. Strong people do that. They keep things moving. It was during one of those visits that I first noticed something I couldn't quite name. Elaine was standing in the living room, holding a framed photo from the mantel. It was of us as children, me with my arm around her shoulders, both of us grinning, missing teeth and sunburned. She turned the frame over, then set it down carefully. "You've done so much," she said, not looking at me. There was a tone to it, not gratitude, something else, something measuring. "I just do," I said, and that was the truth, or at least the version I lived with. That night, after Elaine left, Mom asked me if I'd ever thought about moving back into the house. "It would make things easier," she said, folding her hands in her lap, "for both of us." I looked around the living room, the sagging couch, the familiar cracks in the walls, and felt a flicker of something like hope, like maybe my sacrifices had been seen, tallied, understood. "We'll see," I told her. "Let's take it one step at a time." I didn't know then that some steps were already being taken without me. I didn't know that love, in my family, had always come with conditions I'd never been allowed to read. Not yet. The first time the idea crossed my mind that something might be wrong, I dismissed it the way I dismiss so many other small discomforts in my life, by telling myself I was being dramatic. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that felt heavier than it should have. The sky was low and gray, and the house smelled faintly of boiled cabbage from lunch. My mother sat in her recliner, a knitted blanket tucked under her chin, watching a rerun she'd already seen 3 times. I was sorting mail at the kitchen table when I noticed an envelope that didn't belong to me. It was cream-colored, thick paper, addressed in a careful, looping script. My mother's name was spelled out in full, including her middle initial, something only official correspondence ever bothered with. "What's this?" I asked, holding it up. She glanced over, squinting. "Oh, that must be from the lawyer." My hand froze midair. "What lawyer?" She waved a dismissive hand, already turning back to the television. "Oh, you know, estate planning. Everyone has to do it sometime." Everyone, as if it were something casual, like changing light bulbs. I sat down slowly. "Mom, when did you start talking to a lawyer?" She sighed, the sound sharp with irritation. "Elaine suggested it. She said it was important to have things in order." There it was again, Elaine's name floating between us like a bridge I was expected to cross without question. I wanted to ask why no one had mentioned this to me. I wanted to ask why, after all these years of managing every practical detail of my mother's life, this had happened quietly, without my knowledge. But my mother's eyes were already closed, her breathing slow and shallow. I folded the envelope back into the stack and told myself it was nothing. People plan their estates all the time. Still, that night, I lay awake longer than usual. The radiator clicked and groaned, and somewhere down the hall, a neighbor's television murmured through the wall. My thoughts circled the same question without landing anywhere solid. Why Elaine? Over the next few weeks, little things began to stand out. Mom started mentioning Elaine more often, what she thought about this medication, how she felt about the doctor's recommendations, what she'd said about the house. "Elaine thinks I should repaint the living room," Mom said one afternoon, studying the wall like it might answer back. "She does?" I asked. "What color?" "Oh, something lighter, more cheerful." I looked at the walls, the same pale yellow they'd been for decades. "Do you want to repaint?" She shrugged. "If Elaine thinks it's better." There was a shift happening, subtle but unmistakable. Decisions that used to pass through me now seemed to detour around my presence entirely. I found notes on the counter written in Elaine's handwriting, lists of questions for doctors, reminders about bills. I hadn't missed a payment in years, yet here were instructions as if I'd suddenly become unreliable. One evening, while I was washing dishes, Mom said, "Elaine worries you're doing too much." I laughed before I could stop myself. "Doing too much of what?" she said softly. "Taking care of me." I turned off the faucet and dried my hands, the towel rough against my skin. "Does she? She thinks I rely on you too heavily." The words landed wrong, as if care were a flaw, as if love were a debt accruing interest. "I'm fine," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "This is what families do." Mom didn't argue. She just nodded, eyes fixed on a spot somewhere beyond me. The lawyer's letters kept coming. I never opened them. I told myself it wasn't my place, that my mother deserved privacy, autonomy, dignity. But something gnawed at me all the same. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning, months later. I arrived at Mom's house earlier than usual, a bag of groceries balanced on my hip. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual. As I stepped inside, I heard voices from the living room, low, serious. Elaine's voice. I stopped just inside the doorway, my shoe still on the mat. "Just want to make sure everything's clear, no confusion later," Elaine said. "I trust you. You always know what's best," Mom replied. My chest tightened. I stepped forward, the grocery bag crinkling loudly. Both of them looked up, startled. "Oh," Elaine said, smiling too quickly. "You're early." "I didn't know you were here," I said. "We were just talking," Mom added, smoothing her sweater. "Elaine came to check on me." "Of course. I'll put these away." As I moved toward the kitchen, I noticed a folder on the counter, legal-sized, thick. My name wasn't on it. Elaine followed me into the kitchen, lowering her voice. "We were just going over some paperwork, nothing serious." "What kind of paperwork?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the refrigerator. "Just planning for the future." I closed the fridge door and turned to face her. She looked the same as always, well-dressed, composed, that familiar blend of concern and confidence that had always made adults trust her more. "You could have told me," I said. Her smile faltered just for a second. "We didn't want to worry you." I nodded slowly. "About what?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out and touched my arm, her hand warm and light. "You've done so much. We just want to make sure you don't burn out." It sounded kind, reasonable, almost loving. But something in her eyes, something calculating, made my stomach twist. That night, I drove home with the radio off, the silence pressing in around me. At a red light, I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and closed my eyes. I thought of all the years I'd rearranged my life around my mother's needs, of the checks knitted, the calls made, the quiet sacrifices no one had asked me to make, but everyone seemed happy to accept. And for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if I'd misunderstood my role entirely. Not the caretaker, the placeholder, someone useful until someone better stepped in. I told myself I was being unfair, that families were messy, that love didn't always look the way we expected. But once a thought takes root, it doesn't need permission to grow. It just waits.
I tried to let it go. That's the truth, even if it makes me sound foolish in hindsight. I told myself that suspicion was a kind of poison, and I'd lived too long drinking from cups I didn't question. So I went back to routine, back to the unspoken agreement that my needs came last. But something had shifted inside me, like a loose floorboard I could no longer step on without feeling it bend. I started paying closer attention. It was the way my mother stopped asking me to come by on certain days. The way she'd say, "Elaine's handling it," when I mentioned refilling prescriptions or scheduling appointments. The way phone calls grew shorter, more distracted. Once, when I asked about a doctor's visit I knew was coming up, Mom hesitated. "Oh, Elaine went with me," she said. "I didn't want to bother you at work." I stared at the phone long after the call ended. For years, I'd arranged my schedule around those appointments, taken half days without complaint, sat in hard plastic chairs, listening to medical terms and translating them into something my mother could understand. Now, apparently, I was a bother. I began to notice how often Elaine called, sometimes while I was there. Mom's voice would soften, brighten. She'd straighten in her chair as if preparing to be seen. One afternoon, while Mom napped, I did something I'm not proud of. I opened the drawer where she kept her papers. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There was no swelling music, no righteous anger, just a quiet, practical impulse, like checking the weather before leaving the house. Inside were neatly labeled folders: medical, insurance, utilities, and then one marked estate. My fingers trembled as I pulled it out. The documents inside were dense and formal, words stacked on top of words. I wasn't looking for details. I was looking for my name. I didn't find it. The house was listed as the primary asset, beneficiary Elaine. There were notes in the margins, handwritten, Elaine's handwriting. Ensure clarity. Avoid confusion. Make sure this is fair. Fair. I closed the folder carefully, sliding it back into place as if it might burn me if I moved too fast. My heart pounded in my ears, loud and insistent. I sat at the kitchen table and waited for my breathing to slow. When my mother woke, she found me still there, hands folded, staring at the same spot on the wall. "You look tired," she said. "I am," I replied. "Mom, can we talk?" She sat across from me, her movements slower these days, her face lined in ways that felt new every time I noticed them. "What's wrong?" I chose my words carefully, the way you do when you're walking on ice. "I saw the paperwork." Her eyes flickered just a fraction of a second. "Enough." "You went through my things?" she asked, her tone sharper than I'd expected. "I did," I said, "because no one thought to tell me." She leaned back, crossing her arms. "Elaine said you might overreact." There it was. I felt something hollow out inside me, like a room being emptied all at once. "Overreact to what?" I asked. "To the will," she said, "to how things are set up." "And how are things set up?" My voice was calm, too calm. She hesitated, then sighed. "Elaine will get the house." I waited. She didn't continue. "And me?" I asked quietly. "You've always managed on your own," she said, as if that explained everything. "Elaine needs stability." I stared at her, searching her face for something I recognized. "I paid for that house." "You helped," she corrected. I laughed then, a short, brittle sound that surprised us both. "Helped? Mom, I covered the mortgage, the repairs, the taxes, for years." She waved her hand, dismissing the details. "You did it because you wanted to." "No," I said. "I did it because you needed me." Silence settled between us, thick and uncomfortable. "Elaine has children. I want to make sure they're secure." "And I don't?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. She looked away. "You don't have the same responsibilities." I thought of the nights I'd driven home exhausted, the relationships I'd let wither because there was always something else that needed doing, the choices I'd made quietly without applause. I gave up a lot. "You're strong," she replied. "You always have been." There it was again. Strength as justification, strength as erasure. "I need some air," I said, standing up. I walked out onto the porch, the boards creaking under my feet. The sky was pale, washed out, like it couldn't decide what mood to settle into. Behind me, I heard the door open. Elaine's voice followed, light and concerned. "Hey," she said, "we didn't want to hurt you." I turned to face her. "Then why does it feel like you planned to?" She frowned as if genuinely puzzled. "We're just trying to be practical." "By cutting me out?" "You weren't cut out. You were considered." The word felt like a slap. I built my life around this family, around Mom. And we appreciate that, but appreciation doesn't mean entitlement. I stared at her, at the calm certainty in her expression, and understood something I'd been avoiding for years. In this family, love was measured by need, and I had made myself too capable to be needed. That night, I drove home with my hand shaking on the wheel, the weight of everything pressing down on me at once. I realized then that this wasn't just about a house. It was about being seen. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if anyone ever truly had. I didn't go back to my mother's house for 3 weeks after that. Not because I was punishing her, not because I was trying to make a point. I simply didn't know how to walk into a place that had quietly rewritten my role without my consent. Those weeks felt strangely empty. Evenings stretched longer than they used to. I'd come home from work and stand in my apartment doorway, listening to the silence, half expecting my phone to ring with a request or a reminder. It rarely did. When it did, it was Elaine. She left polite messages, concerned ones. "Just checking in. Mom misses you. We should talk." I deleted them all. The lawyer called again during that time. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to it twice before finally calling back. "I just want to understand," I told him, "how this happened without me being involved at all." There was a pause on the line, the kind professionals use when they're choosing words carefully. "Your sister was designated as the primary contact," he said. "She was very thorough." Thorough, that word again, in a different voice. "She provided documentation, financial records, statements about contributions." My chest tightened. "What kind of statements?" He hesitated. "She explained that she'd been supporting your mother financially for years." I felt the room tilt slightly, like the floor had shifted under my feet. "That's not true," I said. "I have records, bank statements, receipts." "I'm sure," he replied gently, "if you'd like to contest the will." "No," I said, too quickly. The word came out sharp. "I just wanted to know." After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and spread out the papers I'd kept all those years. Every transfer, every check, notes in the margins where I'd written roof repair or medical copay. I'd kept them out of habit, not strategy, proof of responsibility, not leverage. Now they felt like evidence from a life no one intended to acknowledge. The next time I saw my mother was at the hospital. She'd had a minor stroke, nothing catastrophic, they said, but enough to frighten everyone involved. Elaine called me from the emergency room, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "I didn't know who else to call," she said. I arrived to find Elaine already there, holding Mom's hand, whispering reassurances. A nurse mistook her for the primary caregiver. I stood back, watching, unsure where I fit. When Mom saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "I thought you were mad at me." "I wasn't mad. I was hurt." She squeezed my hand weakly. "I didn't mean to hurt you." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But then Elaine stepped in, smooth as ever.
We're all just stressed. This isn't the time for old misunderstandings. Old misunderstandings. As if the erasure of my role was a miscommunication instead of a choice. Later, while Mom slept, Elaine and I stood in the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. "You should let this go," she said quietly, "for Mom's sake." I looked at her, really looked this time, at the controlled compassion, the practiced calm. "You told the lawyer you paid for the house," I said. She didn't deny it, she just shrugged. "I helped when I could." "That's not what you said." Her lips pressed together. "You've always been dramatic." The word landed hard. "I gave up my life, and you rewrote it." She leaned closer, her voice low. "You don't get rewarded for martyrdom." Something in me snapped then, not loudly, not in a way anyone else could hear, but cleanly, decisively. I realized I wasn't going to win this conversation, or any conversation framed the way she framed it. So I stopped talking. In the days that followed, I visited Mom regularly. I brought soup, straightened her blankets, listened to her complain about hospital food. But something between us had changed. She watched me differently now, as if she sensed a distance she hadn't planned for. One afternoon, she said, "Elaine's been under a lot of pressure." I nodded. "So have I." She sighed. "I never meant for you to feel unappreciated." "But you did," I replied. She reached for my hand. "I thought you understood." "Understood what? That love came with hierarchy? That reliability disqualified you from reward?" I squeezed her hand back, gently withdrawing it from mine. "I think I did. Too late." The real betrayal wasn't the house. It was the story they told about me when I wasn't in the room. The way my years of care became invisible the moment they were inconvenient. That realization settled into me slowly, like sediment in water, until everything I saw was tinged with it. I knew then that something had to change. Not out of revenge, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. And that decision, the quiet resolve to stop playing the role assigned to me, would set everything else in motion.
The first thing I did was stop explaining myself. It sounds small, almost petty, but for someone who had spent her entire life justifying every choice, every boundary, it felt like stepping into a different body. I didn't announce it. I didn't give speeches. I simply let questions hang unanswered and accusations fall flat. When Elaine called to ask why I hadn't come by in a few days, I said, "I've been busy," and left it at that. When my mother asked if I could take her to a follow-up appointment on a day I had already taken off work twice that month, I said, "I can't that day," without adding an apology. There was silence on the other end of the line, not anger, confusion. They weren't used to this version of me. The next step was harder. I gathered every financial record I had, bank statements, canceled checks, invoices from contractors, receipts yellowed with age, and organized them into neat folders. I labeled them carefully, the way I'd always done everything. Not because I planned to storm into a courtroom, but because I needed to see the truth laid out in front of me, undeniable and complete. It took an entire weekend. I barely slept. My apartment filled with the soft rustle of paper, the smell of old ink and dust. Every document was a memory. Here was the check from the year the roof caved in during a storm. I remembered standing in the rain, arguing with the insurance adjuster on the phone while water dripped down my collar. Here was the transfer that covered 3 months of mortgage when Mom's pension was delayed. I remembered lying awake those nights, calculating numbers in the dark. I stacked everything neatly and sat back, exhausted. There it was, my life quantified.
The following week, I asked Elaine to meet me for coffee. She arrived 10 minutes late, flustered, already irritated. She ordered without asking what I wanted. "So," she said, crossing her arms, "what's this about?" I slid the folder across the table. "What's that?" she asked. "Proof," I said. She didn't open it. "Proof of what?" "Of what I paid, what I contributed, what you told the lawyer you did." Her jaw tightened. "Why are you doing this?" I took a breath. "Because I won't let you rewrite me." She scoffed softly. "You're being dramatic again." I leaned forward. "I'm being precise." That got her attention. I opened the folder and began laying out documents one by one, not rushing, not raising my voice. I didn't accuse, I didn't argue, I simply showed. Her confidence wavered as the pile grew. "You didn't need to do all this," she said finally. "I did," I replied, "because silence has been expensive." She stared at the table. "What do you want?" There it was, the question she'd been avoiding. "I want the truth acknowledged, and I want Mom to hear it." Elaine laughed bitterly. "You think this is about fairness. Mom made her decision." "I know," I said. "This isn't about changing the will." Her eyes flicked up. "Then what?" "It's about ending the lie." A few days later, we sat together in my mother's living room. Mom looked tired, smaller than I remembered, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Elaine sat beside her, stiff and defensive. I spoke slowly, carefully, not to accuse, but to clarify. I showed Mom the documents, explained each one, where the money came from, why I'd never mentioned it before. "I didn't want you to feel like a burden," I said. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know." I swallowed. "You didn't ask." Elaine tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand. "Let me finish." For once, she did. "I accepted a role without realizing the cost, and I let it define me. That part is on me." Mom reached for me. "I never meant to take advantage of you." "I know," I said gently, "but intent doesn't erase impact." The room was quiet except for the ticking clock on the wall, loud in the way clocks get when no one wants to speak. Finally, Mom said, "I should have protected you." The words landed heavier than any apology. Elaine stood abruptly. "This is unfair. You're making me the villain." I looked at her. "No, I'm letting the truth speak for itself." She left soon after, the door closing a little harder than necessary. My mother cried that night. Not loudly, just soft, broken sounds that seemed to come from deep inside her. I sat with her, holding her hand, feeling the weight of years pressing between us. "I loved you both differently," she said. "I didn't realize how much that hurt." "I know," I replied, and for the first time, I meant it without bitterness. Nothing was fixed that night. The will remained unchanged, the house was still set to go to Elaine, but something else shifted. The story did, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible inside it. The truth has a way of spreading, even when no one means for it to. I didn't tell anyone outside that living room what had happened. I didn't need to. Families have their own currents, and once something shifts, everyone feels it. A week later, my aunt called. "I just wanted to check on you," she said, her voice cautious. "Your sister mentioned there's been tension." I almost laughed. Tension, as if that word could hold the weight of decades. "I'm okay," I said. "Better than I've been in a while." She paused. "Your mother told me some things." I said nothing. "She didn't realize how much you'd done," my aunt continued. "None of us did." That was how it went. Quiet acknowledgments, sideways apologies. People who had assumed without asking that everything was handled because I handled it. At church the following Sunday, a woman I barely knew squeezed my hand and said, "You're a good daughter." I didn't know what to do with that sentence, so I let it sit between us. Elaine stopped calling. When she did show up, it was with an edge I hadn't seen before. Tight smiles, clipped words. She'd lost something she didn't realize she'd been holding, control of the narrative. At one family gathering, she cornered me in the kitchen while others laughed in the next room. "You humiliated me," she said. "I told the truth," I replied. "You made Mom doubt me." "She doubted herself," I said gently. "That's different." Her eyes flashed. "You always have to be the martyr." I met her gaze. "Not anymore." That was the moment I knew there was no going back. People began to see Elaine differently, not cruelly, not harshly, but clearly. The way she spoke for Mom, the way she positioned herself as indispensable while delegating the unglamorous work. Nothing dramatic happened, no shouting matches, no public confrontations, just a quiet recalibration. My mother changed too. She asked before assuming, thanked me more often. Sometimes she'd watch me with a sadness that felt like regret, though she never said the word. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch watching leaves collect along the railing, she said, "If I could redo things." I stopped her with a small shake of my head. "We don't redo, we go forward." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't, but things will be different." And they were. I reduced my visits, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I took evenings for myself, signed up for a pottery class I'd always dismissed as indulgent, let silence exist without rushing to fill it. At first, the guilt was sharp. It woke me at night, whispered accusations I'd heard my whole life. Selfish, ungrateful, abandoning. But guilt, I learned, often shows up when you stop betraying yourself. The house loomed over everything like an unresolved chord. It was still legally Elaine's future. That hadn't changed. What had changed was my relationship to it. One afternoon, Mom asked if I'd consider moving back in just for a while. I looked around the living room at the furniture I'd paid to reupholster, the walls I'd helped repaint. "I won't live in a house that doesn't see me," I said. She didn't argue. Elaine, on the other hand, did. "You're punishing Mom," she accused during one tense phone call. "I'm choosing myself," I replied. "They're the same to you," she snapped. "No, they're only the same when you benefit." She hung up on me. Months passed. Mom's health stabilized. Elaine visited more often now that she was unmistakably the heir. She took pictures, made plans, talked about renovations. I listened when necessary, detached. One evening, my mother surprised me. "I want to leave you something," she said quietly. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. "Mom." "Not the house," she said. "I know that's settled." I waited. "I want to write a letter about what you gave, what it meant. I want it read after I'm gone." I considered that. "Why?" I asked. "Because money isn't the only inheritance, and I failed you there." I nodded slowly. "If you want." She wrote the letter over the next few weeks. Sometimes she'd ask me how to phrase something. Sometimes she'd just sit, pen hovering, lost in thought. When she finished, she sealed it in an envelope and gave it to me. "Keep it safe," she said. I did. When my mother passed, quietly in her sleep, the house went to Elaine as planned. At the reading of the will, Elaine sat upright, composed, confident. Then the lawyer opened the letter. He read my mother's words aloud, about sacrifice, about quiet strength, about the daughter who carried the weight without asking for praise. The room was still. Elaine stared at the floor. I felt something loosen inside me. Not triumph, not vindication, but release. The truth had been spoken, and that, it turned out, was enough. Grief is quieter than people expect. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped arriving and the phone calls slowed, there was just the absence, a shape where my mother used to be. I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to tell her something small, how the weather had turned, how a song on the radio reminded me of the drives we used to take, and then remember there was no one on the other end anymore. Elaine stayed busy. She threw herself into the house almost immediately. Contractors came and went. Paint samples appeared on the walls like strange little flags. She talked about opening things up and making it brighter, as if the house had been holding its breath all these years. I went once, at her invitation. The furniture was gone. The curtains I'd chosen were replaced with something sleek and unfamiliar. The air smelled like fresh paint and sawdust instead of soup and furniture polish. "It's going to be beautiful," Elaine said, standing in the middle of the living room. "Mom would have loved this." I nodded. "I'm sure." She hesitated, then said, "You could have been part of this." I looked at her, at the house that no longer felt like mine in any way that mattered. "I was part of it, just not the part you wanted to see." She didn't respond. We stood there in silence, two women shaped by the same childhood, standing on opposite sides of a truth we would never share. In the months that followed, something unexpected happened. I stopped feeling angry. Not all at once, not neatly, but in small moments, when I realized I hadn't thought about the house all day, when I caught myself laughing without guilt, when the ache in my chest dulled enough to make room for something else. I found a new apartment, smaller than the old one, but filled with light. I painted the walls a warm gray and hung photos that had nothing to do with family obligation. I learned how to sit still without scanning my phone for emergencies. I took weekends off, real ones. Sometimes I drove past my mother's old street without turning down it. Other times I didn't even think to. Elaine and I spoke less and less. When we did, it was polite, careful, like two people who had finally agreed not to reopen a wound they both understood too well. Once she said, "I didn't know it would cost us this much." I thought about that for a long moment before replying. "It didn't have to," I said. She nodded. "I know." It was the closest we came to an apology. On the anniversary of my mother's death, I opened the letter again. I read it slowly, letting each sentence settle. It wasn't perfect, it didn't erase the past, but it named something I'd lived with in silence for too long. "You were the one who stayed," my mother had written. "You were the one who carried what I could not. I mistook your strength for endlessness, and for that, I am sorry." I folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. I realized then that the house had never really been the point. The real inheritance was permission. Permission to stop proving my worth. Permission to let go of roles that hurt me. Permission to be strong without being invisible. Elaine got the house. I got my life back. And in the quiet that followed all that noise, I found something I hadn't expected. Peace that didn't depend on anyone else's recognition. Not everything ends with reconciliation. Not every wound closes cleanly. But some endings give you back yourself. And sometimes that has to be enough.
If you're listening to my story and feeling that familiar tightness in your chest, I want you to pause for a moment. Because maybe you're the strong one too. Maybe you're the one who stayed late, paid the bills quietly, showed up when it was inconvenient, and told yourself it was just what families do. Maybe you learned early that being dependable meant being overlooked, and you wore that like a badge without realizing how heavy it was becoming. For a long time, I thought love meant endurance, that if I could just hold on long enough, give enough, sacrifice enough, someone would finally see me and say, "You mattered all along." But life doesn't always hand us that moment in the way we imagine. Sometimes recognition comes too late. Sometimes fairness never shows up dressed the way we expected.
And sometimes the closure we're waiting for doesn't arrive as an apology or an inheritance, but as a quiet decision to stop disappearing for the comfort of others. I didn't get the house. What I got was something far more fragile and far more powerful: the courage to step out of a story that only valued me when I was useful. If you're carrying resentment, grief, or exhaustion from loving people who never quite loved you back in the same way, I hope you know this. You're allowed to choose yourself without becoming the villain. You're allowed to set boundaries without explaining your entire history. And you're allowed to walk away from roles that cost you your peace. So let me ask you, if you were in my place, would you have fought for the house? Or would you have chosen the truth and walked away? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story spoke to you, if it felt a little too familiar, please consider subscribing and supporting the channel. These stories are for the ones who stayed quiet for too long. You're not invisible here.